For more than 4 centuries, the legend of Elizabeth the Blind was shrouded in mystery, scandal, and silence. They called her the Virgin Queen, the untouchable monarch who ruled without a king and defeated all who tried to destroy her. But behind the glitter of the crown lay a woman haunted by betrayals, obsessions, and deep fears. In her final days, the most powerful woman in the world was imprisoned, not in a castle, but in her own mind. They say she stopped eating, refused to sleep, and began speaking to the shadows of her past. Was it guilt, madness, or some secret she took to the grave? To this day, historians debate whether her last words were of love, regret, or something much darker, something England never dared admit. Today, we delve into the truth the palace tried to erase, the forbidden loves, the hidden betrayals, and the final torment of a queen who ruled like a god, but died like a ghost. Before we discover the secret that changed the course of history, please like and subscribe to the channel, not just to support the content, but because each subscription tells YouTube that you want more stories like this, full of secrets, drama, and revelations that the world tried to hide. It's your gesture that makes the algorithm understand that this content deserves to reach more people and continue to exist. And believe me, you'll want to watch until the end, because the final revelation will change everything you thought you knew about Elizabeth Vaz. She was born in the eye of the storm, at a time when being a king's daughter was no guarantee, especially when that king was Henry VIII, the man who defied Rome, broke with the church, and ordered the beheading of anyone who dared to contradict him, including his own wife. Elizabeth Tudor came into the world on September 7, 1533, in Greenwich, under a sky that, it is said, seemed more grey than gold. Her birth, which should have been celebrated as the arrival of the heir to an empire, was met with frustration and disappointment. The king had expected a son, a prince, not a girl. From her first breath, Elizabeth learned what it meant to be a disappointment. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was the most loved and hated woman in England. The reason the king broke with the Pope, created a new church, and plunged the kingdom into a war of faith. But the king's love was volatile, like fire in dry straw. And when Anne failed to give him the son he desired, love turned to contempt, contempt turned to accusation, and the accusation ended in bloodshed. Elizabeth was only 2 years old when her mother was taken to the Tower of London, accused of treason, adultery, and even incest, crimes fabricated to justify the impossible. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold with her head held high, and the axe that decapitated her changed her daughter's fate forever. At that moment, Elizabeth ceased to be a princess. She was declared illegitimate, erased from the line of succession, and driven from court. She grew up like a shadow, the daughter of a dead woman, rejected by her own father, watching the throne from afar, as one might gaze at a sun that might burn. She was raised by tutors, educated with rigor and uncommon intelligence. She learned Latin, French, Greek, and Italian. She read philosophy, studied politics, and mastered the arts of diplomacy even before adolescence. But she also learned silence. Elizabeth understood from an early age that words could kill, that a misplaced smile could be interpreted as ambition, and ambition as a threat. The castle, for her, was never a home. It was a minefield of glances and intrigues. She saw stepmothers come and go, some dead, others estranged, all victims of the same king she called father. And even when Henry VIII once again recognized Elizabeth as his legitimate daughter, the gesture came too late. The trust was already dead. When he died in 1547, the girl was only 13, and already carrying the weight of a lifetime of rejection and fear. With her father's death, a new struggle began: survival. Her half-brother, Edward VI, assumed the throne, but his health was fragile, and the power struggles became increasingly dangerous. Elizabeth experienced exile disguised as travel, friendships that hid spies, and even threats of poisoning. The Tudor court was a jungle, and there the young woman learned to hunt with her eyes and survive with her mind. It was during this period that she developed the skill that would make her legendary, the ability to keep secrets even from herself. But the greatest blow was yet to come. After Edward's death, her half-sister Mary Tudor ascended the throne, a devout queen, a fervent Catholic, determined to restore the faith her father had destroyed. To her, Elizabeth was the symbol of sin and heresy, a living reminder of the scandal that had divided England. Accused of conspiracy and treason, Elizabeth was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had died. There alone, surrounded by cold walls and echoes of ghosts, the young princess awaited the same fate. It is said that at night she would listen to the sound of the wind rattling the windows and think of the axe that had once taken Anne Boleyn's life. But the difference is that Elizabeth survived. The experience transformed her. When she left the tower, she was never the same again. She learned that power is not won with force, but with patience, that reigning is, above all, knowing how to wait. That time in the shadows made her the most calculating, intelligent, and resilient woman in English history. Every tear, every betrayal, and every humiliation shaped the queen who would one day become the most feared and respected figure in Europe. Elizabeth understood that love was a trap and weakness an invitation to death. From that moment on, she swore she would never depend on anyone, not a man, not an army, not God. She would be the master of her own destiny, and when the time came, there would be no mercy. The rejected girl would transform into the woman who would make kings kneel before her. And it is at this point, between trauma and ascension, that the next chapter of her story begins, the birth of the kingless queen, the woman who reinvented power and transformed solitude into her most lethal weapon. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, England breathed a sigh of relief and fear at the same time. The country had just emerged from a bloody reign marked by religious persecution and executions in the name of faith. The young queen, just 25, was seen not only as a sovereign, but as a promise of balance in an empire on the brink of collapse. Upon being crowned, Elizabeth swore allegiance, not to a man nor to the Church of Rome, but to England. And that simple phrase changed everything. "I am married to my people," she declared, and the world understood that this woman would never be controlled. From the beginning, foreign advisors and ambassadors pressured her to marry. They said that a single queen was a political danger, a temptation to invaders, and an affront to the natural order of things. But Elizabeth saw marriage as a prison. She observed the tragic fate of her mother, beheaded for loving a king, and that of the stepmothers who followed, some dead, others humiliated, all replaced like chess pieces. The throne was the only companion she could trust. Yet there was one man who made the Queen's icy armor begin to crack: Robert Dudley. Childhood friend, confidant, and advisor. He was the only one who made her laugh when the weight of the crown seemed unbearable. The two shared looks that spoke louder than 1,000 speeches, and soon the entire court was whispering. Elizabeth denied any involvement, but everyone saw the different gleam in her eyes whenever Dudley entered the room. The problem was that he was married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived far from court, isolated, and her health was declining. However, fate, or something darker, intervened tragically. In 1560, Amy was found dead at the foot of a staircase, with her neck broken. The case shocked the kingdom. Was it an accident, a suicide, or a convenient murder? No one knew how to answer. But one thing was certain: Elizabeth's name was tarnished. The queen who preached virtue was now surrounded by rumors of adultery and murder. Her political enemies seized on the scandal. The Catholic Church distributed pamphlets calling her an adulteress and a murderer. Foreign courts whispered that the English crown was in the hands of a sinful woman, and even within her council, many began to doubt her purity. Elizabeth, however, reacted as she knew how, with coldness and calculation. She never admitted her love for Dudley in public, never wept in front of ministers, never openly defended herself. She learned to transform scandal into silence and silence into power. They say she loved Robert, but she loved freedom even more. While he desired her as a woman, she saw him as a reminder of what could never be. In several letters, Elizabeth signed herself as your faithful friend and never as your lover. Even so, she kept Dudley close to her, as a mirror of the choices she didn't make. When he died decades later, the Queen kept a letter from him until the end of her life, hidden in a velvet box beside her bed. The paper was folded and worn, and on it she wrote only one word: your last request. Elizabeth knew that the throne demanded solitude. She refused marriage alliances with French and Austrian princes, and even Philip II of Spain, who had previously been the husband of her sister, Mary Stuart. Each refusal was a political gesture, but also a provocation. She transformed celibacy into a war strategy. While kings tried to dominate her with proposals and treaties, Elizabeth used flirtation as a weapon, keeping everyone interested and no one satisfied. She played the power game perfectly, one day promising a possible marriage, the next declaring herself Bride of England. This psychological dominance earned her a new nickname, the Virgin Queen. But behind her political purity lay a flesh and blood woman who hid her broken heart beneath layers of gold and silk. The kingless queen had turned her pain into a shield. To the world, she was untouchable. Inside, she was a soul who had sacrificed love for survival. Her reign prospered, but the price was high. Elizabeth grew old, alone, surrounded by false courtiers and covered mirrors to hide the passing of time. The Queen, who had earned the respect of Europe, now began to face a new enemy, her own reflection. And, little by little, the ghost of the past returned to haunt her. It was the beginning of a new battle, not against foreign armies or kings, but against fear, guilt, and loneliness. Because, even crowned, Elizabeth knew that the throne was no refuge. It was a gilded prison. And this is where the next chapter of her story begins. The empire of glory and blood. When the kingless queen will prove to the world that she doesn't need love to be eternal, but will discover that all power has a price, and hers would be paid in blood. The reign of Elizabeth I became known as the Golden Age of England. A time when a nation once torn by crisis and religious war rose to become one of the greatest powers in the world. Under her rule, the empire flourished, the seas became British, and the arts came alive as never before. But like every great light, the brilliance of power cast long shadows. And behind the Queen's glory lay blood, pain, and regret. Elizabeth was a born strategist. She knew that the power of a crown was not upheld by swords alone, but by image. She became a symbol, the living embodiment of England itself. Every gesture, every word, even every silence was calculated. Her portraits presented her as something almost divine, immortal, with pale, flawless skin and a serene expression, as if time itself feared to touch her. While much of Europe crumbled under war and corruption, England thrived, sailing under her banner and reaching for the unknown. It was the birth of the British Empire. Nothing, however, defined Elizabeth's power more than her victory over the Spanish Armada. In 1588, Philip II of Spain, the same king who had once sought her hand, set out to destroy her. Spain was then the mightiest empire on earth, and the Pope himself blessed its holy crusade against the heretic queen. When more than 100 Spanish ships and tens of thousands of soldiers crossed the English Channel, England seemed doomed. But Elizabeth did not flee. She rode to the ports herself, clad in silver armor, and addressed her troops like a warrior goddess. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England." Those words changed everything. England rose in defiance. Tempest winds and brilliant strategy did the rest. The Armada was annihilated. The sea was littered with wrecks and bodies, and the myth of Spanish invincibility sank beneath the waves. Elizabeth had defeated the greatest empire in the world, and in doing so became legend. While the people hailed her as heaven sent, her own heart carried scars unseen. The glory of victory did not erase the ghosts of the choices she had been forced to make. Behind the banquets, dances, and Shakespearean plays was a weary woman, surrounded by spies, ambitious courtiers, and enemies disguised as allies. She knew that a throne was nothing but a circle of knives. Every smile could hide a dagger. Yet the act that scarred her soul most deeply was the execution of her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary was her blood relative, the legitimate heir for many Catholics, and therefore a living threat. Beautiful, charismatic, and surrounded by scandal, Mary had been imprisoned for plotting against Elizabeth. But the truth was more tragic. They were both prisoners of the same fate, two powerful women in a world that punished women for power. For years, Elizabeth resisted the demands of Parliament and the Church to have her cousin executed. "I cannot kill a queen," she said, perhaps remembering that her own mother had died the same way. But when the evidence of conspiracy grew and the pressure became unbearable, she finally relented. In 1587, her hand trembling, she signed the death warrant. Days later, Mary Stuart was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. When news of the execution reached her, Elizabeth collapsed in grief. She wept before her council, insisting that she had never authorized it, as if trying to undo the irreversible. But spilled blood cannot be washed away. The guilt of that act haunted her until her final breath. Still, she never allowed the world to see weakness. She continued to rule with discipline and intellect. Under her command, England became a beacon of culture and prosperity. Poets like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe created immortal works under her patronage. Explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh expanded England's dominion across the seas. It was the peak of a nation and the deep isolation of a woman. For Elizabeth knew that every triumph exacted a price she could never reclaim. The victory over the Armada cost her youth, the flowering of the arts cost her sleep, and the death of Mary Stuart cost her peace. The people saw a goddess, but she saw a prisoner. As the years passed, the wrinkles defied the portraits, and the crown grew heavier. The gold of the throne no longer gleamed as before, and the mirrors became her enemies. She covered her face in white paint, hid her fear behind jewels and words. The queen who had built an empire now faced the one enemy no ruler could defeat: time itself. And it is here that the next chapter of her story begins. The ghosts of the heart. When the woman behind the crown begins to confront her own solitude, and the power that once sustained her begins to devour her from within. As the years passed, the weight of the crown began to feel heavier than the gold that held it. Elizabeth I, the woman who had defied kings, empires, and time itself, was now fighting a silent war against the mirror. Behind the title of the Virgin Queen hid a lonely soul, surrounded by glory, yet consumed by emptiness. The palace that once echoed with laughter and applause now whispered with memories, and the same walls that had once symbolized power became the prison of a woman who had everything, except what she desired most: true love and eternal youth. Elizabeth was obsessed with her image. From a young age, she understood that for a woman on the throne, power came not only from intellect, but also from appearance. Every portrait of her was carefully controlled. No artist could paint her without permission, and all official portraits were retouched to show an eternally youthful queen, pale skin, golden hair, and a firm gaze. No wrinkles, no shadows, no time. It was both political and emotional strategy. The image of the Virgin Queen could not age, because aging meant weakness, and weakness was the beginning of the end. But away from the eyes of the court, the truth was different. Time had exacted its toll. Illness crept in, her bones ached constantly, and the face reflected in the mirror was no longer the one that had once inspired fear and fascination. Elizabeth began ordering the mirrors in her chambers to be covered. She did not want to see time pass or face the ghost staring back, the woman she used to be. In private letters, she spoke of melancholy of the spirit, a deep sadness that even the throne could not heal. As her friends died and allies drifted away, the Queen grew more and more alone. Robert Dudley, the man who might have been the great love of her life, was gone. Frances Walsingham, her most loyal counselor too, had passed. Shakespeare and the artists of her court still sang her praises, but even poetry could no longer bring comfort. Elizabeth was surrounded by flatterers, courtiers who smiled too much and lied too well. She knew that deep down they were all waiting for the same thing, the moment she would die. They say that in her final years, Elizabeth wept often. She wept when she saw her old portraits, when she heard the songs of her youth, when she realized that despite all her power, she would end her life in solitude. One night, her servants found her sitting on the floor for hours, silent, staring into nothing. When they tried to help her up, she whispered, "Thrones are cold." Few words, but enough to sum up a lifetime of solitude disguised as glory. The title of the Virgin Queen, once a symbol of strength and purity, had become a burden. Elizabeth knew that the image the world adored no longer existed. The thick white makeup hid the wrinkles, but not the sorrow. The lead-based powder she used to preserve her beauty was slowly poisoning her. Every effort to preserve the illusion of youth was, ironically, a step closer to death. Her closest servants claimed that at night the Queen spoke to herself. She mentioned names from the past, called out for Dudley, and sometimes spoke to her mother, Anne Boleyn, as if seeking answers. "Why does love kill the women in our family?" she once murmured. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps guilt, or perhaps the dawning awareness that loneliness is the price of greatness. Even so, Elizabeth never allowed the public to see her weakness. In her rare appearances, she stood tall, her gaze steady, her smile carefully measured. She wore heavy gowns embroidered with gold and jewels so grand they nearly obscured her face, a kind of armor made of luxury to protect what little remained of herself. And in a way, it worked. To the people, she was still the immortal monarch, the woman who had turned England into an empire. But within the walls of Whitehall, her empire was crumbling. Time, her most silent enemy, was winning. The voices of the past grew louder, and the fear of being forgotten consumed her. Elizabeth dreaded that after her death, the world would remember only the Queen, not the woman. She wanted her story to be told, but feared its judgment. And perhaps that is why, until the end, she tried to control her own narrative. To the world, Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen, a symbol of purity and female power. But in the empty corridors of her palace, she was simply Elizabeth, a tired woman, prisoner of her own image, haunted by ghosts only she could see. And it is at this point, between vanity and vulnerability, that the next chapter of her story begins. The fall of the invisible throne. When England's last and greatest queen faces the one enemy no ruler has ever defeated, the weight of her own end. In the final months of her life, Elizabeth I was no longer the queen the world knew. The woman who had once defied empires, who had spoken to armies clad in armor, and who had been called the Virgin Queen, had now become a fragile, haunted and silent figure. The throne, once a symbol of power, had become an altar of solitude. Richmond Palace, which had once been home to laughter, dancing and banquets, now echoed only to the sound of the wind and the slow footsteps of a monarch who seemed to converse with the ghosts of her own past. Elizabeth refused doctors. She said she needed no medicine, only peace. She refused food, refused rest, even refused bed. She spent entire nights standing motionless, staring into space, as if waiting for someone who would never return. She murmured names, memories, secrets. Some servants said she spoke to Robert Dudley, the great love of her life, dead for years. Others swore they heard the name of Mary Stuart, the cousin she had ordered executed. And there were still those who said that on certain nights the Queen seemed to speak to herself in a low voice, as if confessing sins she had never dared reveal. The image of that woman, once feared by kings and revered by crowds, was now that of a pale figure, her eyes lost in time. She dressed only in white, not the white of purity, but the white of farewell. She seemed always ready for a wedding that never happened, for a life she never lived. Some said that by choosing white, Elizabeth wanted to reconcile herself with fate, to die as the bride the world had denied her. Exhaustion took over her body, but her mind still fought. Even weak, the Queen remained lucid, surrounded by advisors who watched her with reverence and fear. They knew that any wrong word could be the last memory she would leave behind. At times, Elizabeth would remain silent for hours. At others, she spoke incessantly, mixing memories and delusions. She remembered the wars, the betrayals, the speeches, and sometimes, amidst the turmoil, she returned to being the queen of old, strong, proud, brilliant. But these moments were short-lived. She had lost everyone she loved. Her childhood friends were dead, her allies had departed, and even the sun seemed to have abandoned the throne. Her succession was uncertain, and the weight of past decisions returned to her like a silent judgment. The walls of her room, covered with tapestries and old portraits, became witnesses to a spectacle of pain and grandeur. Elizabeth did not cry. She simply remained there, her eyes fixed on something invisible, as if she saw before her all those who had already departed: Anne Boleyn, Mary Stuart, Robert Dudley, and even the ghosts of the enemies she had defeated. The servants tried to persuade her to lie down, but she refused. "Kings die standing up," she said, and so she remained for hours, propped up against the pillows, her head held high, as if she still wore the invisible crown that time had failed to take away. The queen who had never bowed to anyone would not bow even to death. Finally, her body gave way. In the early hours of March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I departed in silence. There were no screams, no prayers, only the sound of the wind rushing through the palace windows and the light touch of the white cloth covering her body. She was 69 years old. The longest and most brilliant reign in English history to date was coming to an end. With her, the Tudor dynasty also ended, and a new era began. But what remained most impressive is what remained afterward. Even in death, Elizabeth did not disappear. Her face lived on in portraits, books, stories, and the memories of a people who loved and feared her in equal measure. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, next to Mary Tudor, the sister who once sought to destroy her. On the tomb, the chosen inscription read, "Companions in peace, sisters in hope." Beautiful words, yet laden with irony, coming from a woman who never knew true peace. Elizabeth's death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a legend. For some, she was a saint, a visionary, the guardian of England. For others, she was a cold tyrant, driven by vanity and fear. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in a woman who, to rule a world made for men, had to turn her heart to stone. Even today, her spirit seems to inhabit the corridors of power. Some say her presence is felt on silent nights in the abbey when the wind blows and the candles flicker for no reason. They say that sometimes a white shadow crosses the marble floor, head held high and gaze distant. The same posture of someone who never learned to kneel, and this is where the final chapter of this story begins. The legacy and the curse. When the legend of Elizabeth transcends time and transforms into something greater than the throne, the eternal portrait of a queen who defied death but could not escape her own solitude. Today, centuries after her death, Elizabeth I's name still echoes like a spell. Her story transcended time and became a mirror of power, courage, and loneliness. She is remembered as a symbol of feminine strength, a woman who ruled alone in a world that believed only men could lead. But behind the glory, there is also a curse, the invisible price Elizabeth paid for becoming eternal. Her image spanned generations, shaping the concept of leadership and independence. Queens, presidents, and women of power around the world looked to her for inspiration. But few understood the weight that this crown carried. Elizabeth was not just the Virgin Queen. She was the woman who transformed weakness into a weapon, rejection into power, and pain into strategy. The throne was her shield, and also her prison. Elizabeth's strength was built on fear, the fear of being forgotten, of being betrayed, of showing herself vulnerable. Her serene gaze in the portraits, frozen in time, is not only a symbol of majesty, it is also the reflection of a woman who never rested. Every line of her expression carries the silence of the nights she cried alone, the echo of voices that no longer existed, and the weight of the ghosts that had haunted her since childhood. To the people, she was the savior of England, the strategist who defeated the Spanish Armada and founded the greatest empire in history. But to herself, she was a survivor, the woman who could not love, who could not grow old, who could not make mistakes. Elizabeth sacrificed everything in the name of stability, her heart, her youth, and peace. She lived surrounded by gold, but died surrounded by silence. The curious thing is that even in death, Elizabeth did not disappear. She became an idea, a myth that lives on in stories, in TV series, in films, in classrooms, and in the collective memory. Her figure inspires fascination because she embodies human duality, glory and pain, power and loneliness, love and sacrifice. To this day, scholars and artists struggle to understand who Elizabeth I truly was, the woman behind the crown. Some say her true curse was never being able to simply be Elizabeth. She always had to be Her Majesty, even when the weight of it crushed her insides. She was never a wife, mother, or lover. She was queen. And this choice, which transformed her into a legend, also condemned her to an eternity of solitude. But perhaps this is the most powerful legacy she left, that of a woman who dared to defy fate, who, in a world made for men, decided to reign alone, and did it better than any of them. Elizabeth I was not perfect, she was human, and perhaps that is precisely what makes her unforgettable. And it is thus between myth and mortality that the story of England's most famous queen comes to an end. Or perhaps not, because myths never die. They merely become echoes that time refuses to erase. And so, we end our journey through one of history's most enigmatic and fascinating figures. Elizabeth I, the woman who defied everything and everyone, who transformed rejection into power and loneliness into a crown. A symbol of intelligence, strategy, and strength, but also of sacrifice and fear. The queen who conquered empires, but did not conquer time. And perhaps that's precisely what makes her so human, so close to us. Because in the end, we all seek the same thing she did, to be remembered. If you've made it this far, it shows that you too were touched by this story. So before you leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like just a click, but it's much more than that. When you subscribe, YouTube understands that this type of content, historical, intense, and full of emotion, deserves to reach more people. It's the simplest and most powerful way to keep this channel alive, bringing more epic stories like this one, full of mystery, drama, and truths that time has tried to hide. And I want to know, what surprised you most about Elizabeth's story? Was it her loneliness, the power with which she ruled, or the fact that she chose the throne over love? Leave a comment with the part that struck you most. I read them all, and I want to know what you think of this woman who changed the world simply by being herself. And of course, don't leave just yet. Another video is showing up here on the screen, and trust me, it's even more interesting and captivating than this one. A story that will leave you breathless, full of twists and turns and secrets you need to know. Click now and continue this journey through the past with me. Because after all, the stories that leave the biggest mark on us are the ones that never truly end.